This case does not begin with discovery. It begins with an obligation left unfinished. Fred L. Brewer Jr. was recorded as lost in 1944. His death was acknowledged early. Reports were filed. Status was assigned. The system moved forward. What did not occur was identification, burial under his own name, or a place where his family could stand and know where he rested. For decades, administrative closure substituted for completion of duty. A file marked resolved, concealed work left undone. This is not a story of recovery. It is a record of responsibility delayed for 79 years. When that delay finally ended, it did not restore what was lost. It corrected what should have been done. The numbers tell part of the story. 79 years between death and burial, a pilot lost at 23. Parents who died without answers. A grave marked unknown, while his name was carved on a wall just yards away. But numbers cannot measure what those years cost the people who waited. They cannot account for the parents who grew old, carrying an absence they could not locate, or the siblings who inherited a story without an ending, or the moment when hope turned quietly into resignation. What follows is an attempt to account for both, the procedural failure and the human cost it generated. Fred Lorenzo Brewer Jr. was born on August 4, 1921, in Charlotte, North Carolina, into a city governed by limits that required no explanation. In the 1920s and 1930s, Charlotte functioned on separation that was visible in streets, schools, churches, and workplaces. Neighborhoods were assigned. Opportunity was rationed. Progress was permitted only along paths already drawn and carefully enforced. For black families, daily life required attention to boundaries and an understanding of how to move without drawing notice. The Brooklyn neighborhood where the Brewers lived was not simply a residential area. It was a world built by necessity. A place where black families created what the larger city denied them. Black-owned businesses lined the streets. Doctors maintained practices. The Ebenezer Baptist Church stood as both spiritual center and community anchor. Fred was the firstborn son of Fred Brewer Sr. and Janie Dunlap Brewer, a couple who represented the striving black middle class of the interwar period. His father worked as a hotel bellman, service work that required managing other people's comfort while maintaining one's own dignity. His mother, Janie, managed the household with the same precision her son would later bring to pre-flight inspections. In their home, work was expected. Conduct mattered. Reputation was something to be guarded quietly rather than asserted loudly. Responsibility was not framed as virtue. It was assumed as condition. Fred grew up alongside his younger sister Gladys, in an environment that emphasized what scholars would later call respectability politics. The idea that excellence in education and conduct could serve as a shield against the sided indignities of segregation. This manifested in his daily routine. Disciplined focus on schooling, regular attendance at church, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor that masked a fierce intellect. One can imagine the dinner table conversations in that household. Not dramatic declarations, but quiet assessments. How was school? Fine. Your teacher say anything? Said I did well on the test. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. Just the steady accumulation of competence. Family members later recalled nothing remarkable about his early ambitions. He did not announce plans or rehearse dissatisfaction. He learned early how to meet expectations without inviting attention. This was not passivity. It was a learned discipline shaped by context. In a city where deviation carried cost, predictability provided a measure of safety. Fred attended Second Ward High School, the segregated institution where black students in Charlotte received whatever education the city budget allocated after white schools had taken their share. He did not distinguish himself as a challenger or a standout, but he learned how to operate inside systems as they were presented, not as they claimed to be. He graduated in 1938, carrying with him not just a diploma, but a refined understanding of how to navigate institutions that did not want him there. This skill would prove essential. His acceptance to Shaw University in Raleigh represented more than educational opportunity. Shaw, founded in 1865, was the oldest historically black college or university in the South, a place where black intellectual life could develop without constant surveillance, where excellence was expected rather than exceptional. At Shaw, Fred was not a passive student. He was a central figure in the campus dialogue. He majored in the sciences, working as an assistant in the chemistry laboratory in 1940. This detail matters more than it might appear. Chemistry demanded precision. Formulas did not accommodate approximation. Measurements required exactness. A misplaced decimal killed results as surely as misplaced trust in flight killed pilots. The habits he developed in that laboratory, check, verify, document, repeat, would later govern how he inspected aircraft. The discipline was transferable because it was fundamental. But Fred's engagement extended beyond laboratory benches. He served as editor of the Shaw Journal and Bear, the student publication. In the early 1940s, the black press functioned as the nervous system of civil rights organizing. To edit a publication was to shape conversation, to decide what mattered, to give structure to urgency. As an editor, Fred would have been deeply engaged with the WWII campaign rhetoric. Victory over fascism abroad. Victory over racism at home. His leadership earned formal recognition when he was listed in the 1941 through 42 edition of Who's Who Among Students in American Universities and Colleges. A rare honor that marked him as one of the nation's most promising young black leaders. His engagement extended to national platforms. He served as a student representative at the National Intercollegiate Christian Council in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in 1941, and as a delegate to the National Conference of Negro Youth in 1942. These were gathering points for future leaders of the civil rights movement. Fred was positioning himself not just for a career, but for a life of public service and advocacy. One wonders what Fred thought during those conferences, whether he saw himself as part of a movement that would eventually dismantle the system he had learned to navigate so carefully, or whether he simply focused on the immediate work in front of him. The records do not say. What they show is a man preparing himself for usefulness. His family must have felt pride watching him develop. Their son, moving through spaces his parents could not access, carrying their hopes into rooms they would never enter. The weight of that trust is invisible in photographs, but impossible to miss in context. Upon his graduation from Shaw in 1942, Fred's personal plans were subsumed by the national emergency of World War II. He enlisted in the United States Army in November 1943. At this specific historical juncture, the War Department was under immense pressure from civil rights organizations to allow African Americans to serve in combat roles, particularly in the Army Air Forces. This pressure birthed what became known as the Tuskegee Experiment, a segregated training program designed to determine if black men had the mental and physical aptitude to fly military aircraft. The question itself was insulting. The need to answer it was enraging, but the cadets answered it anyway, because proving the point mattered more than expressing the rage. Fred was accepted into this elite program. The psychological burden on these cadets was immense. They faced a paradox. They had to master the complex art of flight while navigating a military structure that largely viewed them as inferior. A specific fear haunted many of the cadets, including Fred, being grounded or washed out, not due to lack of skill, but due to arbitrary quotas or prejudiced instructors. To be dismissed would not just be a personal failure. It would be seen as a failure of the race. In a segregated force, flying status was never fully secure. Fred feared exclusion more than injury. Being grounded meant removal from the work he had trained for and proven capable of doing. It meant disappearance without movement. Fred's response to that risk was careful compliance. He minimized error. He avoided unnecessary attention. He trusted procedure more than fairness, because procedure was the only reliable protection available. Fairness was abstract. Procedure was tangible. Fred navigated this gauntlet with the same discipline he applied to the chemistry lab. He progressed through primary, basic, and advanced flight training. Days began before sunrise. Physical conditioning came first, runs in Alabama heat, calisthenics until muscles burned, endurance tests designed to eliminate the weak. Then came classroom instruction, meteorology, navigation, aircraft systems, radio procedures, emergency protocols. After classroom work came simulator time, where mistakes were documented and performance tracked closely. Finally, flight hours, the only part of the day where the abstract became concrete. Fatigue was constant. Mistakes were documented. Performance was tracked closely. There was little privacy in success or failure. Fred adapted by becoming precise. He followed checklists carefully. He did not rely on confidence when procedure existed. He did not hurry through drills. He learned systems as written and adhered to them closely. In an environment where judgment was uneven, predictability functioned as protection. Those who trained alongside him later described him as dependable. He was not loud. He did not dominate conversations. He did not perform confidence. He completed assignments and returned equipment in proper condition. In a segregated force, this reliability mattered. Discipline was not only required, it was examined. One can imagine the pressure of that existence, knowing that every flight was not just a test of skill, but an audition for worthiness. That every landing was being watched by people hoping you would fail, so they could confirm what they already believed. On March 12, 1944, Fred graduated with Class 44C SE and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He pinned silver pilot wings to his tunic, a concrete symbol of having disproven the doubts of the establishment. The wings were real. The achievement was real. What came next would test whether the system that had trained him would also protect him. Assignment to the Tuskegee Airmen placed Fred inside the 100th Fighter Squadron of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, named for the distinctive markings on their aircraft. These squadrons were observed closely by military leadership and civilian critics alike. Their performance was treated as evidence beyond the individual. Errors risked being generalized. Success did not guarantee equal recognition. The weight of representation was present even when unspoken. Fred did not articulate this pressure publicly. There are no records of complaint or commentary. He adjusted quietly. He learned how to perform under scrutiny without attracting attention. He allowed procedure to speak for him. Fred deployed to the European theater. The squadron, after a period of flying P-39s and P-47s, transitioned to the P-51 Mustang, the premier escort fighter of the war. Fred took immense pride in flying the Mustang. It was a machine of speed and power that equalized the playing field. In the air, there was no segregation, only altitude and airspeed. The aircraft he flew, the P-51 Mustang, represented both technical advancement and professional scrutiny. For Fred, flying that aircraft placed him in a role denied to black pilots for decades. Pride existed, but it was controlled. Pride could not override caution. A mistake in that aircraft carried consequences beyond the individual. His daily routine at Ramitelli Air Base in Italy was a mix of tension and boredom common to the air war. It reflected his understanding that survival depended on repetition and attention. Mornings began with physical training. The body had to endure 6-hour missions at altitude, where oxygen was thin and cold penetrated flight suits. Strength mattered. Stamina mattered more. Aircraft inspection followed. He examined control surfaces, fuel systems, fittings, and instrumentation meticulously. He did not assume prior checks were sufficient. He verified them himself. These inspections were not ceremonial. They were personal responsibility. The ground crew maintained the aircraft, but Fred's life depended on it. He checked. His assigned Mustang was nicknamed Travelin' Light, likely a reference to the Billie Holiday song. The nose art featured a skinny rabbit, a touch of personal whimsy in a world defined by seriousness. Whether Fred chose the name or inherited it from a previous pilot, the records do not say. What matters is that he maintained it with the same care he brought to everything else. Briefings followed in strict sequence. Weather conditions were reviewed carefully. Routes and altitudes were assigned. Contingencies were outlined. Enemy fighter activity was assessed. Fred listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it was to confirm understanding rather than challenge instruction. He did not seek distinction through commentary. The rituals mattered because they created islands of control in an ocean of variables. Weather could not be controlled. Enemy fighters could not be predicted. Mechanical failure could not be eliminated. But inspections could be thorough. Checklists could be followed. Discipline could be maintained. Evenings, when time allowed, were reserved for letters home. These letters were restrained. They reported status. They asked for news from Charlotte. They did not dramatize danger or speculate about outcomes. The handwriting was even and block-like, consistent across pages. There was no flourish, no urgency. One sentence appears repeatedly in recollections. Tell everybody, I'm doing fine up here. The phrasing manages information rather than denies risk. Fred understood what his family could carry and limited what he sent. He did not invite worry. His family, reading those letters in Charlotte, must have clung to that steady tone, the evenness of the handwriting, the predictability of the updates. Their son was far away, doing dangerous work, but he sounded like himself. That had to be enough. Perhaps his mother reread them at night, tracing the block letters with her finger. Perhaps his father showed them to neighbors. Quiet pride in a son doing what few black men had been allowed to do. Perhaps his sister Gladys kept them in a box, already beginning to understand that these might be all she would have. He carried specific objects that grounded him. Leather flight gloves worn smooth by use, maintained, not preserved. His pilot wings were worn correctly, unaltered. His uniform followed regulation closely. Nothing about his appearance suggested a desire to stand out or to be remembered. He blended into procedure. He did not write about combat in detail. He did not describe fear. He focused on routine. This restraint was not emotional absence. It was discipline reinforced by environment and experience. Dwelling on uncertainty did not improve performance. His post-war plan was modest and concrete. He intended to continue flying. There is no record of broader ambition. He did not speak of reforming institutions or changing society. He spoke of staying in the air. Flying was work he understood and wanted to keep doing. The war was not the end of his ambition. It was merely the proving ground. At home, family members received his letters and kept them. They did not search for coded meaning. They did not assume concealment. He said he was fine. That matched the man they knew. The absence of alarm was itself reassuring. Fred did not cultivate myth. He lived inside routines and expected those routines to hold. He believed systems would function as written, even if unevenly applied. That belief was not naive. It was necessary for daily function. This ordinariness matters. It establishes scale. Fred did not seek recognition. He sought continuity. When he later failed to return, the disruption was not dramatic. It was procedural. A routine did not complete. The war did not interrupt a heroic arc. It interrupted a process Fred had learned to manage carefully. His disappearance would later be framed as loss. At the time, it was simply a failure to return from assignment. Nothing in his early service suggested that his name would one day be separated from his remains, or that paperwork would advance without completing its obligation. He trusted systems because systems were the only structure available to him. At the beginning, there was only a man preparing for routine missions, writing home in even handwriting, and accepting risk as part of duty. The cost of what would follow was not yet visible. The war had not taken him yet. It had only positioned him. By the autumn of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had established a reputation for excellence in bomber escort duties. Operating from Ramitelli Air Base on the Adriatic coast of Italy, they were tasked with protecting B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 15th Air Force as they struck targets deep in southern and central Europe. The mission on October 19, 1944, was a deep penetration strike. The target was the oil refineries in Regensburg, Germany, critical infrastructure in the Allied strategic bombing campaign, focused on dismantling the Nazi synthetic oil industry to ground the Luftwaffe and immobilize the Wehrmacht. However, reaching Regensburg required crossing the formidable barrier of the Alps, a geographical gauntlet that was often as deadly as enemy flak. On the morning of October 19th, 2nd Lieutenant Fred Brewer climbed into the cockpit of Travelin' Light. He was one of 57 fighters from the 332nd assigned to the escort wing. The briefing had warned of difficult weather, but the strategic necessity of the mission overrode meteorological concerns. Weather was addressed during briefing, as it always was. Conditions were described as unstable at altitude, with cloud layers expected along portions of the route. Visibility was forecast to vary. These assessments were familiar to pilots operating in late autumn over Central Europe. The briefing officer likely delivered the information in the same flat tone used every morning. Weather over the Alps will be variable. Expect cloud layers between 15 and 20,000 feet. Stay in formation. Maintain radio discipline. No delay was ordered. No alternate routing was mandated. The mission was approved to proceed. Fred prepared according to procedure. Aircraft inspection followed checklist, not memory. Control surfaces were examined. Ailerons, elevators, rudder, all moving freely, no binding. Fuel load was verified, tanks full, no leaks visible. Instruments were checked and rechecked. Altimeter set, compass calibrated, artificial horizon level. There is no record of discrepancy. Maintenance logs from that period do not indicate unresolved mechanical issues with the P-51C Mustang he flew, marked Travel and Light. At takeoff, the aircraft was considered fully mission capable. One wonders what Fred thought during that pre-flight inspection. Did he notice the cold? Did he think about the weather report? Did he consider the risks? Or had repetition made them background noise? The records do not say. What they show is a pilot following procedure, exactly as trained. Formation assembly occurred without incident. Aircraft departed on schedule. Early phases of the flight proceeded normally. Radio traffic reflected standard coordination. Position was maintained. Fred held formation discipline consistent with his prior sorties. There is no indication of deviation or difficulty during the initial leg. For a time, it was just another mission. The formation took off and climbed to altitude, assembling with the bomber stream. As they moved northward over the Adriatic and approached the Udine area of northern Italy, the weather deteriorated drastically. The scattered clouds thickened into a solid, overcast wall. Flying in heavy cloud cover, what pilots called instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC, was one of the most dangerous aspects of World War II aviation. Pilots relied on primitive gyroscopic instruments. Spatial disorientation, vertigo, was a constant threat. Without external visual reference, the inner ear lied. What felt like level flight might be a descending spiral. What felt like climbing might be a stall developing. Instruments told the truth. But trusting instruments, when your body screamed otherwise, required discipline that fatigue eroded. As the formation encountered the heavy cloud bank, the 332nd Fighters attempted to climb to get on top of the weather. It was during this steep climb, likely around 19 to 20,000 feet, that tragedy struck. According to a squadron comrade, likely Lieutenant Charles Duke or another wingman in his flight element who filed the subsequent report, Fred's aircraft was seen attempting to pull up sharply. In the thin air of high altitude, the P-51C's laminar flow wing reached its critical angle of attack. The airflow over the wings detached. The aircraft stalled. A P-51 stall, especially under power, is violent. The high torque of the engine causes the aircraft to snap roll. Witnesses observed Travel and Light roll over uncontrollably. The physical details of the next few seconds are terrifyingly clear. Fred, fighting the G-forces of the spin, managed to jettison the canopy. The plexiglass bubble ripped away, exposing him to the freezing slipstream. This action indicates a clear intent to bail out. However, the squadron comrade watching from the formation did not see a body exit the cockpit. He did not see a parachute blossom against the gray mist. He only saw the Mustang, now a piece of uncontrolled metal, disappear into the solid cloud deck below. There was no distress call. The mountains of the Julian Alps, shrouded in fog, rose up to meet the aircraft. In the silence of the cockpit, Fred Brewer was isolated, miles above the earth, wrestling with a machine that had ceased to fly. What happened in those final minutes can only be reconstructed from physics and terrain. The aircraft was flying. Then it was not. Somewhere in the transition between those states, Fred Brewer realized he would not return to Ramitelli. Did he try to climb above the weather? Did he attempt to navigate by dead reckoning? Did he know when the mountain appeared, or did it arrive without warning from the gray? One moment he was there, holding position in the formation. The next moment, clouds swallowed his aircraft. The wingman who last saw him likely kept looking for several seconds, expecting Travel and Light to reappear from the gray. When it did not, procedure dictated continuing the mission. Individual aircraft losses could not compromise the escort assignment. The squadron continued to Regensburg. They fought off German fighters, protected the bombers, and returned to Ramitelli. But the hard stand for Travel and Light remained empty. While the 332nd Fighter Group tallied its losses at Ramitelli, the reality of the crash was being played out on the ground in northern Italy. The aircraft had impacted near the commune of Moggio Udinese, a mountainous area near the border with Austria. The impact was not observed by Allied personnel. No friendly ground units were present. No reconnaissance aircraft documented the site during active operations. The crash occurred beyond immediate military awareness. Later, civilian observation would establish the location, but at the time, no report reached Allied command. The aircraft struck the mountainside with sufficient force to fragment. Wreckage scattered downslope. Debris was distributed across uneven terrain. There was no evidence of controlled descent. There was no indication of attempted bailout. Impact characteristics were consistent with sudden termination rather than gradual failure. Italian civilians in the area witnessed the aftermath. The violence of a high-speed impact in mountainous terrain leaves little intact. The wreckage was scattered. The locals, living under the dual pressures of German occupation and the harsh mountain winter, did what decency demanded. They located the remains of the pilot. A witness from Maggio Udinese, decades later, would recall the sound, sharp, unnatural, a noise that echoed briefly through the valley and then stopped. Others remembered finding twisted metal on the slopes, bent in ways that suggested speed no human body could survive. Because identification of the remains was not immediately possible, dog tags may have been lost in the impact, and the body was likely severely traumatized. The locals buried the pilot in the civilian cemetery of Maggio Udinese. To them, he was an unknown liberator, a fallen Icarus who had dropped from the clouds trying to free their country. They did not know his name, but they remembered him. When spring came and flowers bloomed, some villagers left them at the site. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Someone cared that he was there. The civilians of Maggio Udinese understood something the system did not: that memory requires location, and that a body without a name still deserves dignity. From the squadron's perspective, Fred failed to return. Post-mission procedures recorded him as missing. Initial reports reflected uncertainty rather than confirmation. Weather conditions were cited as a contributing factor. Last known position was approximated based on formation route and timing. No enemy engagement was confirmed. No distress signal was logged. Administrative classification followed protocol. Fred was listed as missing in action. This designation acknowledged absence without concluding death. It allowed for theoretical survival, though circumstances did not favor that assumption. The absence of a distress call influenced internal assessment. Mechanical failure without transmission, spatial disorientation in cloud, or weather-induced terrain impact became probable explanations. None could be confirmed at that time. The administrative machinery immediately began to grind. Missing aircrew report number 9600 was opened. Forms were filled. Notifications were prepared. The squadron intelligence officer wrote in careful military prose: aircraft last observed entering cloud layer. No further contact established. Pilot presumed lost. The words were accurate. They were also inadequate. They could not account for what it meant that the man who had written, "Tell everybody I'm doing fine," would write nothing again. Operations continued. The squadron flew subsequent missions. Personnel adjusted. Losses were absorbed. Fred's absence was noted, processed, and carried forward in paperwork. The war did not pause to investigate terrain it could not reach. For those who flew that day, the loss registered as a gap in formation. An aircraft did not return. A name was added to a list. The day's work concluded. At the evening meal, someone likely sat in Fred's usual seat without thinking. His footlocker remained in the barracks, personal effects awaiting inventory and shipment home. The other pilots understood. They had all lost wingmen. The understanding did not make it easier. It simply made it familiar. For Fred, separation had already become final. There was no opportunity for rescue, no opportunity for communication, no opportunity for correction once visual contact was lost. Weather and terrain closed options rapidly. The crash site remained undocumented during active combat operations. Mountain conditions and operational priorities delayed civilian access. Wreckage remained where it fell. Evidence existed, but it was isolated and uncollected. In the weeks that followed, administrative processes advanced. Fred's status transitioned from missing to presumed dead, according to standard timelines. The change reflected elapsed time, not new information. The absence of recovery did not prevent conclusion. After a specified period, usually 1 year, the military declared a missing pilot presumed dead. This was not cruelty. It was procedure designed to provide closure when certainty was impossible. It allowed families to settle estates, collect benefits, and begin grieving what could not be reversed. At no point during wartime operations was the crash site examined by Allied recovery teams. The location was outside known search areas. Terrain, weather, and ongoing combat rendered such efforts impractical. The site remained beyond institutional reach. Italian civilians in the region would later recall the crash. At the time, these observations did not reach Allied authorities in a form that could be acted upon. Information existed without pathway. The mission that began as routine ended without witness, without signal, and without immediate accounting. Fred's aircraft disappeared into terrain that offered no report except impact. From that moment forward, the system recorded loss without location. Fred was honored in unit histories. His name appeared on rosters and casualty lists, but on the ground, he was absent. The war moved on, records closed, responsibility was deferred. The disappearance was not dramatic, it was procedural. A pilot failed to return. The system acknowledged loss and proceeded. What remained unresolved was where Fred was, and whether his name would ever return to the ground where he fell. That question would remain unanswered for decades. The accounting began only after the fighting ended, and even then, it did not begin all at once. When Allied operations concluded in northern Italy, the terrain where Fred L. Brewer Jr.'s aircraft had fallen shifted in status, but not in character. The mountains near Maggio Udinese were no longer behind enemy lines, but they remained remote, steep, and governed by weather that resisted planning. Snow lingered at elevation. Rain moved quickly through valleys. Paths that appeared navigable on maps proved unstable underfoot. During the war, no recovery attempt had been possible. Aircraft losses in mountainous regions were recorded, but retrieval was postponed indefinitely. Air combat demanded forward motion. Recovery required pause. The system was built to prioritize the former. When the American Graves Registration Service expanded its work across Europe in the immediate post-war period, it did so under pressure. The scale of the task was unprecedented. Thousands of American service members remained unaccounted for. Some lay in temporary battlefield graves. Others rested in aircraft wreckage, unmarked and inaccessible. Time had already altered evidence. Bodies had decomposed. Identification markers had corroded. Crash sites had been disturbed by weather, animals, and scavengers. What had been discrete events during the war had become archaeological puzzles by the peace. The service's mandate was explicit. Locate remains where possible. Recover them. Identify them if evidence allowed. If identification could not be achieved, provide burial under appropriate designation. The objective was dignity and order, not exhaustive reconstruction. The instructions were clear, but the reality was overwhelming. Recovery teams worked in conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. Equipment was limited. Personnel were trained for procedure, not investigation. They were instructed to collect remains, not interpret events. In 1946, recovery teams reached the mountainous area near Maggio Udinese. Access required coordination with local authorities and civilian guides. Movement was slow. The teams worked methodically, examining reports of American war dead, prioritizing sites based on reliability of information and accessibility. When they arrived at the civilian cemetery in Maggio Udinese, locals directed them to the grave of the American pilot. The team documented the location and began exhumation. What they found was not a discrete crash site in the conventional sense. The grave contained human remains, but the crash site itself was scattered across the mountainside. The aircraft had not come to rest intact. Impact against the mountain had fragmented the structure. Aluminum panels were scattered across uneven ground. Smaller components lay downslope. There was no clear perimeter, no single point of focus. Environmental exposure had already altered the scene. Snowmelt had shifted debris. Rain had carried lighter material downhill. Animals had disturbed remains. Time had erased sequence. Human remains were present, but they were incomplete. Exposure and impact had compromised integrity. Nothing was arranged in a way that allowed reconstruction of position or movement. The recovery was careful, but it was constrained by what remained. Personnel collected what they could. Remains were gathered. General location was noted. Aircraft debris was acknowledged, but not cataloged in detail. There was no effort to reconstruct the aircraft's final moments. That was not the task assigned. The recovery team worked with professionalism and respect. They photographed the site. They documented what they found. They prepared the remains for transport. They did their job exactly as they were trained to do it. What they could not do was identify the pilot. Identification procedures followed established standards of the period. These relied primarily on dental records, personal effects, uniform fragments, and physical characteristics. In many cases, identification was possible because remains were intact, equipment survived, or records were complete. In Fred's case, these conditions did not exist. This moment represents the first critical failure in the timeline of responsibility. The AGRS officers had access to MACR 9600. They knew a P-51 from the 332nd Fighter Group had crashed in this vicinity. They knew the pilot was African American, a distinctive identifier in a segregated military. Yet, the forensic capabilities of 1946 were limited to dental charts and height estimates. If the dental records were incomplete or the remains too fragmented to yield a distinct chart, identification was impossible. Dental records were incomplete or unavailable for comparison. Personal effects could not be reliably associated. Dog tags may have been lost in the impact or rendered unreadable by exposure. Uniform fragments lacked identifying markers. Serial numbers were not recoverable. Physical characteristics could not be matched with certainty to a single individual. The science of 1946 could not answer the question the system demanded. Whose remains are these? Without that answer, procedure dictated the outcome. The absence of certainty dictated classification. The remains were designated Unknown Zone 125 Mirandola. The X-file became the pilot's new identity. The link between the physical body and the name Fred Brewer was severed. This designation was administrative, not interpretive. It did not reflect doubt about nationality or service. It reflected the inability to assign a name with confidence using available methods. The recovery team likely discussed possibilities. They may have reviewed the list of missing pilots from the region. Fred's name would have been on that list. But possibility was not certainty. Protocol required certainty. Without it, the remains became unknown. Zone 125. The remains were transported to the newly established Florence American Cemetery and Memorial in Impruneta, Italy. This site was designed to be a permanent resting place for the American dead of the Italian campaign. The cemetery itself was orderly, planned, and governed by protocol. Rows were aligned. Records were kept precisely. Each grave received the same care, the same dignity. In a solemn ceremony, Zone 125 was lowered into a plot. A cross was raised above the grave. Fred was Christian, bearing the standard inscription for the unidentified. Here rests in honored glory, a comrade in arms known but to God. The code served a function. It allowed the cemetery to track location and sequence. It did not preserve identity. It explicitly acknowledged absence of name. Simultaneously, because Fred's body had not been identified, the name Fred L. Brewer Jr. was carved into the tablets of the missing. A monumental wall at the same cemetery listing those whose remains were unrecovered. The tragic irony was profound. Fred Brewer's name was on the wall, and his body was in the ground just a few hundred yards away. They were separated not by miles, but by the lack of a forensic key to unlock the connection. The case was closed. The Army declared him unrecoverable. At that moment, institutional responsibility was considered fulfilled. Fred's personnel file already recorded his loss. His casualty status had transitioned from missing in action to presumed dead, according to established timelines. His unit history acknowledged the loss. His family had received notification that he had died in service. From the perspective of the system, the remaining requirement was burial. That requirement had now been met. A grave existed. The remains rested in consecrated ground, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. Honors had been rendered. What did not occur was connection. No formal process existed to revisit unidentified burials unless new evidence emerged. No cross-referencing mechanism linked crash locations to unidentified graves systematically. Civilian observations were not integrated. Geographic correlation was not pursued beyond general awareness. This was not negligence. It was the limit of what the system could accomplish with available resources, technology, and time pressure. Official language reinforced compartmentalization. The grave was recorded as unknown. Cemetery maps listed plots, not names. Burial records documented date and designation. There was no field that asked whether this unknown might correspond to a known missing pilot. The forms did not invite the question, because the system did not expect to answer it. Recovery personnel moved to the next site. Files were transferred to archive. The grave's registration service demobilized. Personnel returned to civilian life. The machinery that had processed Fred's remains dispersed. This was structure, not conspiracy. The system operated as designed. The problem was that the design assumed identification would succeed or fail definitively. It did not account for cases where identification failed, not because evidence was absent, but because evidence could not yet be read. The cost of that assumption would accumulate for decades. By the time burial was completed in 1946, the United States was demobilizing. Attention turned toward rebuilding, reintegration, and future conflict. The unresolved details of individual losses faded from institutional focus. The question of where Fred was did not disappear. It was simply no longer asked by those empowered to answer it. Responsibility was not denied. It was deferred indefinitely. For decades, the grave remained unchanged. The marker remained in place. The name remained absent. The system moved on. What remained unfinished would require outside memory, new technology, and renewed willingness to reopen closed files. None of that existed in the immediate aftermath. The work stopped not because it was completed, but because the process defined completion differently than families did. This was the immediate aftermath. It did not resolve absence. It formalized it. For Fred's family in Charlotte, notification of death arrived without location. The telegram was formal and restrained. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Second Lieutenant Fred L. Brewer Jr., has been reported missing in action since 19 October over Italy. Weeks later, another communication. Report now received states remains recovered but not identified. Buried as unknown. They were told he had been lost during the war. They were told he had died in service. They were not told where he rested. There was no grave bearing his name. There was no place to stand. Absence remained abstract. Death was acknowledged, but place was withheld by circumstance rather than intent. His mother, Janie, kept the telegrams in a drawer. She would take them out occasionally, reading them again as though repetition might reveal information the first reading had missed. The words never changed. His father, Fred Sr., stopped talking about his son's return. The waiting had ended, but the knowing had not begun. What they experienced was a particular cruelty of war, confirmation without closure. They knew their son was dead. They did not know where he lay. Grief could not localize. It remained diffuse, ambient, inescapable. Their son had trained to fly. He had written letters in steady handwriting. He had said he was fine. Then he was gone. And the government, the institution to which they had entrusted their son, could tell them he was dead, but not where he rested. The inadequacy of that accounting is difficult to overstate. In the immediate post-war years, this outcome was not unusual. Many families experienced similar uncertainty. Language of sacrifice filled public space. Loss was framed collectively. The absence of a grave was painful, but it was normalized. Official communication emphasized patience. The expectation, often unspoken, was that families would accept what information was available and refrain from pressing for what was not. Over time, normalization hardened into silence. The delay did not arrive as an event. It settled in as a condition. Once Fred's remains were buried as unidentified and his military file was closed, the system regarded the matter as resolved. Loss had been acknowledged. Recovery had been executed. Burial had been completed. The administrative sequence ended where procedure said it should end. No further action was scheduled. No reminder was set. No obligation remained active on paper. For Fred's family, the experience unfolded on a different timeline. At first, the waiting was active. Letters already received were reread. Photographs were kept visible. Conversations returned to earlier details. The possibility that more information might arrive was not dismissed. Silence was interpreted as delay, not finality. Janie Brewer maintained her son's room as it had been when he left. His books remained on the shelf. His clothes hung in the closet. She dusted regularly. When guests asked why, she had no answer that satisfied them. It simply felt wrong to pack him away, while the question of where he was remained open. Fred Sr. made inquiries through official channels. He wrote to the War Department requesting information about his son's burial location. The responses were polite and unhelpful. Remains recovered but unidentified. Unable to provide grave location at this time. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. Further information never came. They did not know that the file had already been closed. They did not know that further information would require someone to reopen a case the system considered finished. As months turned into years, the character of waiting changed. What began as anticipation shifted into endurance. Each year without update made the absence of information feel less temporary. The lack of a grave became something to be explained to others, and eventually to oneself. Fred had died, but he had not been returned in any form that could be touched or visited. This absence existed in a psychological space that had no name. It was neither hope nor hopelessness. It was suspension. A named grave allows grief to localize. It provides a physical boundary to loss. Standing at a gravestone, you know where your attention should rest. You know what you are addressing. The ground becomes a focal point for memory, for ritual, for the private conversations people have with the dead. Without that place, mourning remains abstract. Fred's family had no ground to associate with memory, no stone to touch, no flowers to leave. Grief had nowhere specific to go, so it went everywhere. On the anniversary of his death, there was no grave to visit. On his birthday, there was no marker to decorate. On holidays, when the family gathered, his absence was felt, but could not be marked physically. He existed in conversation and memory, but not in location. Other families in Charlotte could visit Elmwood Cemetery, where relatives rested under named stones. The Brewer family had only telegrams, and the words died in service. This created what researchers would later call ambiguous loss. Grief without closure. Mourning without finality. The missing are neither fully present nor fully gone. They occupy a space between categories that language struggles to describe. This mattered in ways that were not easily articulated. Fred's family had been handed an impossibility. Mourn the dead without knowing where death had occurred. As time passed, Fred's parents aged. The urgency they once felt gave way to resignation. Institutions did not write again. Inquiries, if made, produced no new information. Eventually, the expectation of resolution faded. The question did not disappear, but it ceased to feel actionable. Where is Fred became a question without an answer, and after enough years, questions without answers stopped being asked aloud. Janie Brewer died in the 1960s without knowing where her son lay. Her final years were marked by declining health and the accumulated weight of unanswered questions. She never stopped hoping for information. She simply stopped expecting it. Fred Sr. followed in the 1970s. He carried the question to his grave. When Fred's parents died, they did so without knowing where their son rested. That fact cannot be corrected retroactively. The delay compounded with each passing year. What might have meant something tangible to parents lost meaning for those who followed. Responsibility fulfilled late does not arrive intact. It arrives altered by time. This is the cost of delay. Responsibility fulfilled late does not arrive intact. It arrives after its most important recipients are absent. It corrects the record without repairing the experience. The next generation inherited Fred as a story rather than a presence. Siblings carried memory of a brother who went to war and did not return. They remembered his letters, his handwriting, the tone of his updates. His sister Gladys kept his photograph on her wall. When her children asked who the man in the uniform was, she told them, "That's your Uncle Fred. He was a pilot. He died in the war." The children absorbed the story. They understood he had served. They understood he had died. But they did not know where he rested. When asked, Gladys could not answer. The story ended without a location. For nieces, nephews, and later descendants, Fred became more distant still. He existed as a name on a family tree, a photograph in a box, a reference in military records. His service was real. His absence was real. But it was unanchored. Brenda Brewer, a cousin, grew up with Fred's story as family legend. He was brilliant, she would later recall. One of the smartest and nicest people our family ever produced. We were so proud of him. But we never knew where he was. That hurt. It hurt every time we talked about him. This generational shift mattered because it changed the stakes. The cost of delay is not evenly distributed. Early resolution benefits those closest to the loss. Late resolution arrives when those people are gone. What remains is acknowledgement without restoration. At the institutional level, nothing prompted reconsideration. Unidentified graves were not treated as open questions. They were treated as concluded outcomes. The designation unknown was an endpoint, not an invitation for future inquiry. Advances in technology did not automatically reopen cases. DNA analysis emerged in the 1980s and 90s. Mitochondrial DNA techniques became standard in the 2000s. These tools transformed forensic capability, but they did not, by themselves, trigger reviews of old cases. No mandate required periodic review. The system did not return to unresolved identifications unless external pressure or new evidence forced it to do so. Fred's grave remained marked Unknown Zone 125. The designation did not change. Cemetery records remained static. Visitors passed the marker without context. The unknowns were not hidden. They were present, orderly, and silent. Their existence signaled limitation rather than urgency. The marble was white and clean. The grass was cut. The American flag flew over the cemetery. Everything looked properly maintained. Everything looked finished. Only the families knew otherwise. Fred's name continued to appear in other places. He was listed among the Tuskegee Airmen. His service was recorded. His aircraft loss was documented. Unit histories acknowledged him. Casualty lists included him. In these records, he existed fully as a person. He had a name, a rank, a unit, a date of death. Historians could research him. Journalists could write about him. His story could be told. On the ground, he did not exist as Fred L. Brewer Jr. He existed as Unknown Zone 125. This separation persisted without contradiction, because the systems that held these records did not communicate with each other in a way that demanded reconciliation. Personnel files, cemetery records, and crash reports existed in parallel. No mechanism required that they converge. The irony was invisible to the system, but obvious to anyone looking. Fred's name was carved on the wall of the missing at Florence American Cemetery. His body was buried in the same cemetery, just yards away. The two existed in proximity without connection. As decades passed, the war receded from living memory into history. Attention shifted to later conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. The urgency that once surrounded accounting for World War II losses faded. The institutional language of unaccounted for remained, but its emotional charge diminished as the number of living witnesses declined. Fred's case did not attract attention because it did not stand out. There was no controversy, no public pressure, no unresolved mystery framed as such. There was only a completed file and an unnamed grave. The absence did not interrupt institutional routine. Documentary filmmakers made films about the Tuskegee Airmen. Books were written. Museums created exhibits. The 332nd Fighter Group received recognition, honors, congressional medals. The story was told and retold. But Fred L. Brewer Jr. remained unnamed in Florence. The public celebrated the Tuskegee Airmen in the abstract, while Fred lay unidentified in particular. The disconnect went unnoticed. The tragedy of Fred's disappearance was compounded by a second erasure at home. In the 1960s and 70s, the city of Charlotte embarked on a massive urban renewal project. The Brooklyn neighborhood, the vibrant, self-sustaining black community where Fred grew up, was systematically demolished. The house on South Myers Street, where Fred wrote his letters, was bulldozed. The streets he walked were paved over. The Ebenezer Baptist Church was forced to relocate. Fred Brewer was now missing in Italy, and the physical evidence of his life in Charlotte was being wiped from the map. He was becoming a ghost in two hemispheres. For Fred's family, the waiting did not resolve itself. It simply became part of family history. When his name was mentioned, at family gatherings, during conversations about military service, in discussions of family legacy, it carried an asterisk that was never written down, but always present. Fred died in Italy. That was known. Where? In Italy. Unknown. The absence of place became an accepted part of the narrative. Younger family members learned to phrase their questions differently. Not where is Uncle Fred buried, but do we know where Uncle Fred is buried? The shift from where is to do we know where represented the accommodation of uncertainty. The family had learned that some questions did not have answers. This acceptance was not closure. It was accommodation. The question remained, but the expectation of an answer faded. Each year, without correction, increased the distance between loss and remedy. Each year made restoration less complete. The system did not feel that loss. Families did. For nearly 8 decades, Fred remained honored in abstraction, and missing in fact. His name existed in history, but not on stone. His service was acknowledged, but his place was not. The system waited because it had no reason to move. The family waited because they had no alternative. Neither waiting produced resolution. Time became its own form of loss. Not just the loss of Fred himself, but the loss of the people who had loved him most. His parents died waiting. His siblings died waiting. The squadron comrades, who might have stood at his grave and remembered missions flown together, they died waiting too. When resolution finally came, it would come for people who had inherited his story rather than lived it. That is not the same thing. It has value, but it is not the same. By the time any reconsideration would occur, nearly everyone who had known Fred directly would be gone. Parents, siblings, squadron peers, the people for whom identification would have had immediate meaning were no longer alive to receive it. Only much later would the separation between name and remains be challenged, not by the passage of time, but by the persistence of memory outside the original process. Until then, Fred remained where the system left him, recorded, buried, unnamed. Responsibility remained deferred, not denied. The long wait was not empty. It was filled with silence that accumulated weight over decades, pressing down on everyone who carried the question but could not answer it. For 79 years, the file of Zone 125 sat in the archives. The world moved on. The military integrated in 1948, rendering the segregated unit he flew with a historical artifact. The civil rights movement, which Fred had presaged with his activism at Shaw, transformed the nation. Men walked on the moon. The Cold War rose and fell. Through it all, the grave in Florence remained marked unknown. The system had recorded the loss, but delayed the responsibility of resolution. The cost of this delay was paid by the parents who died waiting. The reopening did not begin with a directive, a policy change, or a sudden institutional realization. It began with art. The breakthrough in the Brewer case did not begin with a microscope, but with a piece of art. It is a testament to the fact that while institutions may forget, communities often remember. In 2011, researchers investigating World War II crash sites in Italy made a remarkable connection. They found that in the commune of Moggio Udinese, the memory of the crashed pilot had been preserved in a unique way. A local artist, Luigi Costantini, had visited the crash site in the years following the war. He had salvaged twisted pieces of aluminum from the wreckage of the P-51C. Costantini used this war-scarred metal to create a sculpture titled Cristo Crocifisso, Christ Crucified. The sculpture depicted Christ on the cross, fashioned from the very material of the machine that had carried Fred to his death. This object, a fusion of religious devotion and the detritus of war, acted as a physical anchor for the memory of the crash. When researchers examined the metal more closely, they recognized what they were seeing. This was aircraft-grade aluminum, manufactured during the 1940s. The stress patterns, the thickness, the type of deformation, all consistent with high-speed impact. Local oral history provided the missing context. Costantini had collected the metal directly from the crash site. He had incorporated it into his sculpture deliberately. This was not symbolism layered later. It was material continuity. For decades, parishioners had knelt before that crucifix. They had prayed beneath aluminum that had once carried Fred Brewer through the sky. The connection existed without their knowing it. The pilot and the community had been linked by metal and memory, waiting for someone to recognize what that meant. The researchers did not stop with the sculpture. Historians and researchers from the Defense POW, MIA Accounting Agency, and private groups analyzed the provenance of the metal. They confirmed it was American aircraft aluminum. They correlated the location of the wreckage recovery with the flight path of MAC-R 9600. They examined known aircraft losses in northeastern Italy during the relevant period. The number was limited. Few Allied aircraft were recorded as lost in that specific mountainous region during late 1944. Among them was a P-51C Mustang, lost on October 19th and 1944. The pilot was listed as missing and later presumed dead. His name was Fred L. Brewer Jr. The location matched, the time frame aligned. The aircraft type corresponded to the aluminum characteristics observed in the sculpture. More importantly, recovery records from 1946 documented that American Graves Registration Service personnel had exhumed remains from the civilian cemetery in Maggio, Udinese. Those remains had been designated Unknown Zone 125 and transported to Florence American Cemetery. This evidence triggered a review of the X-files from the area. The researchers looked at Unknown Zone 125, recovered from the Maggio Udinese Civilian Cemetery in 1946. The correlation was striking. Asterisk. Location. Maggio Udinese, matches crash site. Asterisk. Time. Recovered 1946, consistent with 1944 crash. Asterisk. Context. The only unrecovered fighter pilot from that specific area and time frame was Fred. The evidence suggested that the unknown soldier venerated in the sculpture's history and the unknown soldier buried in Florence were one and the same, Fred L. Brewer Jr. For the first time, crash location, civilian memory, physical material, recovered remains, and a known missing pilot could be discussed together rather than as isolated facts. What had previously existed as parallel records now had a point of convergence. An analyst at the DPAA reviewed the evidence. She looked at the mission report from October 19, 1944. She looked at the recovery log from 1946. She looked at the cemetery interment record for Unknown Zone 125. She looked at the geographic coordinates. Everything aligned. She made a recommendation. Reopen the case. Authorize exhumation. Apply modern forensic techniques to answer the question that 1946 could not. The DPAA and the American Battle Monuments Commission authorized the disinterment of Zone 125. Based on this compelling historical and circumstantial evidence, in 2022, 76 years after Fred was first buried, his grave at the Florence American Cemetery was opened again. The process followed strict forensic protocol. The cemetery section was cordoned. Photography documented every stage. The earth was removed carefully, layer by layer. The casket was exposed. It was lifted, examined, transported. Inside were the remains that had been designated unknown for more than 7 decades. Bones that had rested beneath that marker while generations passed. Evidence that had existed all along, waiting for technology to catch up with obligation. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the DPAA laboratory at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. This facility is the most advanced forensic skeletal identification lab in the world. The bones of X-Zone 125 were about to undergo the scientific scrutiny that was impossible in 1946. The reopening of the case did not occur because the system remembered. It occurred because it was reminded. Responsibility, once deferred, required external persistence to be reclaimed. The case was reopened not as miracle, not as revelation, but as overdue work finally resumed. The identification of Fred Brewer was a triumph of modern forensic science, utilizing a dual-track approach of anthropology and genomics. DPAA forensic scientists examined the skeletal structure of Zone 125. They built a biological profile to compare against Fred's military records. Stature. The length of the long bones, femur, tibia, was measured to estimate living height. It matched Fred's recorded height. Age. The fusion of epiphyses, bone ends, and the wear on the dentition suggested a male in his early 20s. Fred was 23. Ancestry. Cranial metric analysis indicated African ancestry, consistent with a Tuskegee Airman. The biological profile matched Fred's service records. Height consistent. Age consistent. Ancestry consistent. But consistency was not certainty. Anthropology could narrow possibilities. It could not assign a name with the confidence required for identification. For that, they needed DNA. The breakthrough came through mitochondrial DNA analysis, a technique that had not existed when Fred was first buried. This was the definitive tool. Unlike nuclear DNA, which degrades rapidly over decades, mitochondrial DNA is more robust and is passed down unchanged from mother to child. It persists in bone for decades. It passes unchanged from mother to child, creating a genetic signature that can be traced through maternal lines across generations. The WWII genealogy team began searching for Fred's maternal relatives. They traced his family tree through his mother Janie's line. They located cousins, descendants of Janie Brewer's sisters. They contacted Brenda Brewer and other maternal cousins. They explained what they had found. They asked if she would provide a reference sample. Brenda later recalled the moment. "I couldn't believe it. After all these years. After my grandmother died not knowing. After my mother died not knowing. Now, they were telling me they might have found Fred." She provided the sample immediately. Consent was obtained. Reference samples were collected. This stage took time, not because of difficulty, but because of care. The laboratory extracted mitochondrial DNA from the bone. They sequenced it. They compared it to Brenda's sample. The mtDNA sequence, extracted from the bones of X125, was compared to Brenda Brewer's sample. It was a match. The sequences matched. Laboratory analysis proceeded according to established standards. Results were reviewed internally and independently. No single test was accepted in isolation. Confirmation required convergence. On August 10, 2023, 79 years after his death, the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency issued its finding and officially announced that the remains of unknown Exone 125 were those of Second Lieutenant Fred L. Brewer Jr. The scientist who delivered the final confirmation wrote in her report, "Identification established with scientific certainty through convergence of anthropological analysis, historical correlation, and mitochondrial DNA sequencing." The confirmation arrived not as announcement but as documentation. The language was restrained. Evidence was cited. Conclusions were stated without embellishment. The report marked the end of one process and the exposure of another. The language was technical. The meaning was human. A name had been returned to remains. A family's question had been answered, not in time to matter to those who needed it most, but answered nonetheless. For the agency, the task was now complete. A name had been returned to remains. A record had been corrected. For the family, the meaning was more complex. When Brenda Brewer received the official notification that Fred had been identified, she felt something she could not quite name. Relief, certainly. Vindication that her family's story had been true. But also grief, renewed and sharp, for all the people who should have received this news but never would. "I wished my grandmother could have known," Brenda said. "She died wondering where her son was. She never got to visit his grave. She never got to say goodbye properly. That's what haunts me, not that we didn't know for so long, but that she didn't know when it would have mattered most." 79 years had passed since Fred's death. His parents were long gone. His siblings were gone. Most of his squadron peers were gone. The people for whom identification would have carried immediate, personal weight were not alive to receive it. This was not a failure of the identification process. It was the cost of delay. The DPAA's communication with the family was factual. It did not promise closure. It did not frame identification as resolution. It explained what had been established, how it had been established, and what options were available. This restraint reflected an understanding that certainty does not erase time. The DPAA coordinated with the family. They explained the identification process. They described what came next. They offered options: reburial at Florence, where he had rested for decades, or repatriation to the United States. The family chose repatriation. They elected to have Fred return to the United States for burial. This decision was not framed as recovery, but as completion. Fred had left from home. Returning him there, even after nearly 80 years, represented continuity rather than repair. The family chose to bring him home. After 79 years in Italy, Fred would return to North Carolina. The unknown designation was stripped away. The designation Unknown Zone 125 was formally retired. Cemetery documentation at Florence was amended. Internal databases were updated to reflect that the remains were no longer unidentified. A rosette was placed next to his name on the wall of the missing in Florence, signifying that he was no longer lost. Arrangements were made for burial at Salisbury National Cemetery. Transportation followed military procedure. The remains were escorted. Documentation accompanied them at each stage. There was no public spectacle. The process emphasized accountability rather than display. On December 6, 2023, nearly 80 years after he took off from Ramitelli, Fred Brewer returned to North Carolina. His hearse was met at the airport by a military honor guard. The funeral took place at the Salisbury National Cemetery. It was a spectacle of honor that had been denied to his parents. A horse-drawn caisson carried the flag-draped casket. The Patriot Guard riders escorted the procession. The burial followed established military ritual. A caisson carried the casket. Honor guards performed prescribed movements. A flag was folded and presented to the family. The words spoken were formal. The sequence was precise. There were no additions to account for the years between death and burial. Ritual does not adjust for delay. It proceeds as written. A poignant moment occurred with the presence of Andrew Pendleton, a 101-year-old World War II bomber pilot veteran. Pendleton, reviewing his flight logs, realized that on the day Fred died, October 19, 1944, Fred's squadron was escorting Pendleton's bomber group. Fred had died protecting men like Pendleton. He had flown cover while bombers, vulnerable, slow, loaded with explosives, made their runs over Germany. He had disappeared into cloud while maintaining his position. Pendleton stood as the flag was folded. He watched as it was presented to Brenda Brewer. He saluted a man he had never met, but who had kept him alive 80 years earlier. The living history of the bomber pilot saluting the returned remains of his little friend bridged the gap of 8 decades. The moment bridged time in a way that was almost unbearable in its weight. The ground received a name that had been absent from it for 79 years. The burial provided what had been missing for 79 years, a place. The family could now visit. They could stand at the stone. They could leave flowers. Grief had a location. Memory had ground beneath it. What that moment did requires careful accounting. Brenda Brewer stood at the grave as military honors were rendered exactly as prescribed by regulation. The ritual was precise, formal, unchanged by the decades that had passed. As the flag was folded 13 times and presented to her, she thought about everyone who should have been there but wasn't. Her grandmother Janie, who had died wondering. Her grandfather Fred Sr., who had written letters that were never answered. The siblings, the squadron peers, all gone. It did not restore parents who had waited without answers. It did not return siblings who had lived entire lives without knowing where their brother lay. It did not allow squadron comrades to stand at the grave and see completion of duty. Those losses are not reversible. No identification, regardless of accuracy, can alter that reality. Fred was one of the smartest and nicest people I ever knew, and it is tremendous seeing him on American soil, she remarked. But in her voice was the weight of all those years, all those people who had waited and never received what she now held. But the restoration was incomplete in ways that mattered profoundly. Fred's parents never knew where he was. They died carrying that absence. No amount of eventual identification changes that fact. Janie Brewer never stood at her son's grave. Fred Sr. never saluted the stone. The notification they needed never arrived while they were alive to receive it. What the family received in 2023 was acknowledgement, but not restoration. The record was corrected, but the experience could not be repaired. Brenda understood this. "I'm grateful," she said. "I'm so grateful we finally know. But I grieve for everyone who should be here and isn't. This should have happened decades ago. It didn't. That's not something we can fix." What the burial did was fulfill a responsibility that had remained incomplete, whether acknowledged or not. For decades, Fred's service had been honored abstractly. His name appeared on rosters. His loss was recorded in unit histories. His death was accepted. What was missing was the physical act of placing his name where his remains lay. That omission mattered because burial is not symbolic alone. It is the point at which record meets ground. The cost of delay remained visible even in completion. Responsibility fulfilled late does not arrive intact. It arrives diminished by time. It satisfies obligation but does not repair experience. The family received a burial. They did not receive the years when that burial would have carried different meaning. Parents were denied the knowledge of where their son rested. That absence cannot be retroactively corrected. From an institutional perspective, the case now represented success. An unresolved World War II loss had been accounted for. Modern forensic methods had proven effective. Civilian research had been integrated into formal process. A name had been returned. The file could now be closed with confidence. That assessment is accurate, and it is incomplete. The process worked, but it worked late. The identification did not occur because the system revisited old cases proactively. It occurred because evidence preserved outside institutional framework forced reevaluation. Fred L. Brewer Jr. was not lost to history. He was lost to process. The facts of his death existed early. The crash was observed by squadron comrades. The remains were recovered in 1946. What failed was not discovery, but follow-through. For 79 years, a name and a body occupied separate places because procedure allowed separation to stand in for completion. The case of Fred Brewer stands as a testament to the persistence of memory and the obligation of a nation to its defenders. It took 79 years, but the responsibility was finally fulfilled. The unknown is known. The pilot has cleared the clouds. Fred Brewer is home. When identification finally came, it arrived as correction rather than revelation. It demonstrated not the inevitability of progress, but the consequence of postponement. The recovery, therefore, stands as correction rather than triumph. Fred's burial closed a chapter that had remained open far longer than it should have. It did not close the cost incurred during that time. It did not erase the years when responsibility was deferred, because minimum administrative criteria had been met. The ceremony itself reflected this tension. It was restrained. It was procedural. It did not attempt to compensate for time lost with heightened emotion. The honors rendered were the same as those given to service members buried promptly after death. Equality of ritual does not equate to equality of experience. The flag was folded. The presentation was made. The ground accepted the casket. The moment passed. What remained was accounting. The case endures not as proof of the system's eventual success, but as evidence of its decades-long failure to finish what it started. At Salisbury National Cemetery, Fred's grave marker is white marble, standard issue, aligned perfectly with the others in the row. It bears his name, his rank, his dates. It looks like every other military grave, orderly, dignified, permanent. Visitors who pass it have no way of knowing it took 79 years for that name to appear on that stone. They have no way of knowing about the parents who waited, the siblings who carried questions they could not answer, the decades when he existed in two places at once, named on a wall, unnamed in the ground. The stone does not explain any of that. It simply states what should have been stated in 1946. This is where Fred L. Brewer Jr. rests. The marble is clean. The grass is cut. Everything looks as it should. Only those who know the story understand what that appearance cost and how many people paid the price of waiting for what should never have been delayed. 79 years separated Fred's death from burial under his name. That number does not measure grief. It measures delay. It measures the distance between acknowledgement of loss and fulfillment of obligation. For the family, the burial provided a place. It did not provide restoration. The people who would have needed that place most were not present to see it. What they would have felt cannot be substituted by descendants standing in their place. For the institution, the case was now complete. Records reflected reality. The unidentified designation was removed. The system had finished the task it was designed to finish, albeit long after it should have. What this recovery demonstrates is not the inevitability of progress, but the consequence of postponement. It shows how unresolved cases, once closed administratively, can remain dormant indefinitely unless challenged. It shows how delay compounds loss beyond death itself. Fred had been honored in name long before he was buried under that name. His service was never disputed. What was absent was completion. That absence mattered, not because it erased honor, but because it withheld responsibility. The recovery returned his name to the ground. It did not return him to time. Identification is often treated as the climax of such cases. Here, it functions as exposure. It reveals how long responsibility waited to act, and who paid the price for that waiting. Fred's case now stands complete in records. It does not stand complete in experience. That distinction is the final measure of identification and recovery. Responsibility fulfilled late is still responsibility fulfilled. But it does not undo the cost of lateness. It does not restore the years when that responsibility should have acted. It does not return parents who died wondering, or siblings who carried absence they could not explain. It corrects the record. It does not repair the experience. His name is on the stone now. It should have been there in 1946. The 79 years between those moments cannot be recovered. They can only be accounted for. This is that accounting.